You're exhausted from fighting uphill battles at work, pushing harder while others achieve more with seemingly less effort. Every victory feels like a struggle. Every success drains your energy. While you wonder why winning has to be so difficult when others make it look effortless, I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist who discovered that supreme excellence is subduing the enemy without fighting through effortless victory. What I learned about winning without struggle will transform how you approach every challenge, showing you how to achieve goals through strategic positioning rather than brute force. But first, like this video, subscribe for more ancient wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master effortless victory. Let me share with you the story of how I discovered the art of effortless victory, for it began with my greatest failures and most exhausting struggles. In my early days as a military commander, I was like many of you. I believed that victory required overwhelming force, relentless pressure, and the willingness to sacrifice everything for success. I was wrong, and that error nearly cost me everything. The artifact that reminds me of those difficult days is the bamboo staff of early defeats, a simple walking stick I carried during my first campaign. It bears the scars of countless battles, where I learned that winning through brute force creates victories that feel more like defeats. Each mark on that staff represents a lesson learned the hard way, a reminder that there had to be a better path. My first command was a disaster wrapped in the illusion of success. I had been tasked with defending a strategic mountain pass against a larger enemy force. Like any young commander drunk on theories of war, I believed that courage and determination would overcome superior numbers. I drove my men relentlessly, demanding they fight with the fury of cornered tigers. We held the pass, yes, but at what cost? When the enemy finally retreated, I stood among the bodies of my soldiers, good men who had trusted me with their lives. We had won, but I felt defeated. My forces were decimated. My remaining soldiers were exhausted and demoralized, and I realized that this hollow victory had taught me nothing about true strategic thinking. I had won through sheer stubbornness and the sacrifice of others, not through wisdom. That night, as I sat alone with my bamboo staff, I asked myself a question that would change everything. What if there was a way to achieve the same result without this terrible cost? The enemy had retreated not because we had destroyed them, but because we had made holding the pass too expensive for them. Could we have achieved the same outcome through positioning rather than bloodshed? This question haunted me through the following months. I began to study not just the art of war, but the art of not fighting. I observed how water flows around obstacles rather than crashing against them, how a skilled fisherman uses the current rather than fighting it, how a wise farmer works with the seasons rather than against them. Nature, I realized, achieves its greatest victories through patience, positioning, and the application of force at precisely the right moment. The breakthrough came during my second campaign, when I faced an enemy general known for his brutal directness. Instead of meeting force with force, I chose to make myself appear weak when I was strong, scattered when I was concentrated. I let him think he was pursuing a retreating army, while I was actually leading him into a position where victory would be impossible for him and inevitable for me. When he finally realized his position, he surrendered without a single sword being drawn. His army joined mine, his supplies became our supplies, and what could have been a devastating battle became a peaceful transition of power. I had discovered the supreme excellence subduing the enemy without fighting. The transformation was not just in my military tactics, but in my entire approach to challenges. I learned that true victory is not about overpowering others, but about positioning yourself so that resistance becomes pointless. This principle changed how I approached negotiations, how I built alliances, and how I managed resources. Every aspect of leadership became more efficient, more sustainable, and infinitely more satisfying. My soldiers began to follow me, not out of duty, but out of genuine respect. They saw that I valued their lives enough to find ways to win without unnecessary sacrifice. My reputation grew not as a fierce warrior, but as a leader who could achieve the impossible through strategic thinking rather than brute force. This is the journey that led me to understand that the art of effortless victory is not about avoiding conflict. It is about being so strategically positioned that conflict becomes unnecessary. It is about winning before the battle begins, achieving your objectives through superior positioning rather than superior force. The bamboo staff still sits in my study, a reminder that my greatest teacher was failure, and my greatest discovery was that true strength lies not in the ability to force outcomes, but in the wisdom to position yourself where favorable outcomes become inevitable. The most important lesson I can share with you is this: to subdue the enemy without fighting is the supreme excellence. This principle, carved into the jade seal of subduing enemies that I designed for my personal use, represents the pinnacle of strategic thinking. The seal bears the inscription "Victory without battle," and I used it to mark every document that demonstrated this principle in action. Most people misunderstand what I mean by subduing the enemy without fighting. They think it means avoiding conflict altogether, being passive, or simply hoping problems will resolve themselves. This is not what I teach. Subduing the enemy without fighting means positioning yourself so strategically that resistance becomes pointless and victory becomes inevitable, without the need for destructive confrontation. Let me share with you how I applied this principle during the siege of Ying. The enemy had fortified themselves within seemingly impregnable walls, and conventional military wisdom suggested a prolonged siege that would cost thousands of lives and months of resources. Instead, I studied their supply lines, their internal politics, and their psychological weaknesses. I discovered that the city's water supply came from a single source outside the walls. Rather than attacking the walls directly, I positioned my forces to control this water source. But here's where the supreme excellence comes in. Ni didn't cut off their water immediately. Instead, I made it known that I controlled their lifeline, and I offered generous terms for surrender. The mere knowledge that I could end their resistance whenever I chose made actual fighting unnecessary. The city surrendered within 3 days. No blood was shed, no walls were breached, and no lives were lost. The enemy general later became one of my most trusted advisors because he respected the intelligence behind my approach. This is the power of supreme excellence. It transforms enemies into allies and obstacles into opportunities. In your modern workplace, this principle manifests in countless ways. Instead of engaging in office politics and power struggles, you position yourself as indispensable through your expertise and relationships. Rather than fighting for recognition, you create situations where recognition becomes inevitable. Instead of competing directly with colleagues, you find ways to make collaboration more beneficial than competition. I once observed a skilled diplomat who embodied this principle perfectly. Faced with 2 warring factions, he didn't try to force peace through threats or bribes. Instead, he identified what both sides truly wanted, not their stated positions, but their underlying interests. He then crafted a proposal that gave both sides more than they could achieve through continued fighting. The war ended not because anyone was defeated, but because peace became more attractive than conflict. This is psychological warfare at its finest, but not the kind that manipulates or deceives. It's the kind that aligns interests, creates win-win scenarios, and makes cooperation more logical than competition. When you master this approach, people don't follow you because they have tooth. They follow you because they want to. The supreme excellence principle requires you to think several moves ahead. Like a master chess player who sees the entire board while others focus only on individual pieces. You must understand not just what you want, but why others resist, what they truly need, and how to create conditions where giving you what you want also serves their interests. This approach conserves energy because you're not constantly fighting uphill battles. Instead of exhausting yourself in conflict, you invest your energy in understanding, positioning, and creating favorable conditions. The result is that you achieve more with less effort, maintain better relationships, and create sustainable success rather than temporary victories. The Jade Seal reminds me daily that true power lies not in the ability to force outcomes, but in the wisdom to create conditions where favorable outcomes become the natural result. This is the foundation of effortless victory, not avoiding challenges, but positioning yourself so that challenges resolve themselves in your favor. When you truly understand this principle, you stop seeing obstacles as things to overcome through force and start seeing them as puzzles to solve through strategic positioning. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to demonstrate supreme excellence, and every victory becomes a step toward mastery of the art of effortless winning. The art of strategic positioning is the foundation upon which all effortless victories are built. I learned this through careful study of terrain, timing, and human nature. Lessons that I recorded on the terrain map of advantageous ground, my personal battle map that showed not just geographical features, but the strategic advantages each position offered before conflicts ever began. Understanding positioning begins with recognizing that every situation has multiple dimensions of advantage and disadvantage. Just as I analyzed physical terrain for military campaigns, you must analyze the terrain of your circumstances to identify where you can position yourself for inevitable success. I identified 5 types of ground that determine strategic advantage. First is accessible ground territory that both you and your opposition can reach easily. In modern terms, this represents competitive situations where everyone has equal access to opportunities. Here, victory goes to whoever can execute better, not necessarily who has more resources. Second is entangling ground positions that are easy to enter but difficult to exit. Think of commitments that lock you in without clear escape routes. I learned to recognize these traps and either avoid them entirely or ensure I had multiple exit strategies before entering. Third is temporizing ground positions where neither side gains significant advantage by moving first. These situations require patience and the ability to wait for better conditions. In your career, this might mean recognizing when to stay in your current position while building skills rather than making premature moves. Fourth is narrow ground, positions where small forces can defeat larger ones through superior positioning. These are the situations where David defeats Goliath, where preparation and positioning matter more than raw power or resources. Fifth is precipitous ground, positions of extreme danger that paradoxically can lead to extraordinary victories. When your back is against the wall, conventional limitations disappear and breakthrough performance becomes possible. Let me share how. I applied these principles during the Battle of Buyu. My enemy commanded forces 3 times larger than mine, positioned on higher ground with better supply lines. Conventional military wisdom suggested retreat or surrender. Instead, I studied the terrain map and identified a position that would transform these disadvantages into advantages. I positioned my forces in a narrow valley that prevented the enemy from using their superior numbers effectively. The high ground they occupied became a trap. They couldn't retreat without exposing themselves, and they couldn't advance without funneling through terrain that favored my smaller, more agile force. Their better supply lines became irrelevant because I controlled the timing of engagement. When the battle began, it was already over. Their numerical advantage meant nothing in the confined space. Their positional advantage became a liability. When they couldn't maneuver, what appeared to be my weakness, smaller numbers, became my strength because I needed fewer resources to control the key terrain. The victory was so complete that it appeared effortless to observers. They saw only the final result, not the weeks of careful analysis that made that result inevitable. This is the essence of strategic positioning, winning before the battle begins through superior understanding of the terrain in your professional life. This same principle applies constantly. Instead of competing directly in crowded markets or obvious opportunities, you identify positions where your unique strengths create natural advantages. Rather than fighting for the same promotions everyone else wants, you position yourself in roles where your specific skills make you indispensable. I once advised a merchant who was struggling to compete with larger trading houses. Instead of trying to outspend them, we identified a narrow market segment they couldn't serve effectively: remote mountain villages that required specialized knowledge and smaller shipments. He became the dominant trader in that niche, and eventually expanded from that strong position to challenge the larger houses on equal terms. This is how strategic positioning works in practice. You don't fight where everyone else is fighting. You find terrain where your strengths matter most and your opponent's advantages become irrelevant. You create situations where cooperation with you becomes more logical than competition against you. The key is patient analysis combined with decisive action. Most people either analyze forever without acting, or act without adequate analysis. Mastery comes from thorough preparation followed by swift execution when conditions align. Remember that positioning is not a one-time decision, but an ongoing process. As circumstances change, you must be prepared to adapt your position while maintaining your strategic advantages. The terrain map that guides you today must be updated constantly as the landscape of opportunity shifts. True strategic positioning makes victory appear effortless because all the effort was invested in preparation and analysis rather than in conflict itself. When you position yourself correctly, success becomes the natural result of your circumstances rather than something you must force through willpower and determination. The bronze mirror of self-knowledge sits in my study as a daily reminder of the most fundamental truth in strategic thinking. If you know yourself and know your enemy, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. This polished bronze mirror served me not for vanity, but for the brutal honesty required to see myself clearly, my strengths, my weaknesses, my blind spots, and my potential. Every morning, I would look into that mirror and ask myself 3 questions. What do I truly know about my own capabilities? What do I assume I know about my opposition that might be wrong? What information do I need that I don't currently possess? This daily practice of honest self-assessment became the foundation of my strategic thinking. Most people fail not because they lack courage or resources, but because they operate on incomplete or inaccurate information about themselves and their circumstances. They overestimate their strengths, underestimate their weaknesses, and make assumptions about others based on limited observation rather than systematic intelligence gathering. I learned this lesson painfully during my early campaigns. I once assumed that an enemy general was conventional in his thinking because his previous battles followed predictable patterns. This assumption nearly cost me everything when he revealed himself to be far more innovative than I had credited. From that day forward, I made it my practice to gather intelligence systematically rather than relying on assumptions. My method for knowing myself involved rigorous daily examination. I would review my decisions, analyze my emotional responses, and honestly assess my performance. I kept detailed records of my successes and failures, not to dwell on the past, but to identify patterns that would inform future decisions. I discovered that my greatest strength was patience, the ability to wait for the perfect moment to act. But this strength could become a weakness if I waited too long and missed opportunities. My systematic self-knowledge allowed me to recognize when my natural patience was serving me and when it was holding me back. Knowing your enemy requires the same systematic approach. I developed networks of observers, merchants, and travelers who could provide information about enemy movements, resources, and decision-making patterns. But more importantly, I studied their psychology, what motivated them, what they feared, what they valued most. During my campaign against General Wei, I spent months learning about his background, his previous victories and defeats, his personal relationships, and his strategic preferences. I discovered that he was brilliant in direct confrontation, but struggled with unconventional approaches. He valued honor above pragmatism, which meant he would reject certain tactical options that might give him advantage. This knowledge allowed me to craft a strategy that played to his strengths, while positioning myself to exploit his psychological limitations. I gave him opportunities to demonstrate his tactical brilliance in ways that ultimately served my strategic objectives. He won several battles but lost the war, not because he lacked skill, but because I understood his decision-making patterns better than he understood mine. The same principle applies in your professional relationships. Instead of making assumptions about colleagues, competitors, or superiors, you must invest time in understanding their motivations, their pressures, their goals, and their decision-making patterns. This isn't manipulation, it's strategic empathy that allows you to create mutually beneficial outcomes. I once observed a young administrator who was struggling with a difficult supervisor. Instead of complaining or competing, she spent weeks quietly observing what mattered most to him: efficiency, clear communication, and avoiding surprises. She then adjusted her approach to align with these preferences, making his job easier while achieving her own objectives. Within months, he became her strongest advocate. This is the power of systematic knowledge gathering. When you truly understand both your own capabilities and the motivations of others, you can create scenarios where cooperation becomes the logical choice for everyone involved. The bronze mirror also taught me that self-knowledge must be updated constantly. Your strengths and weaknesses shift with experience, circumstances, and responsibilities. What served you in one situation may limit you in another. Regular self-assessment ensures that your strategic thinking remains grounded in current reality rather than outdated assumptions. Remember that knowing yourself means understanding not just your skills and limitations, but your emotional patterns, your decision-making biases, and your blind spots. The leader who cannot see their own weaknesses clearly will inevitably be defeated by someone who can. Intelligence gathering about others must be systematic and ongoing. People change, circumstances evolve, and new information constantly emerges. The strategic advantage goes to those who update their understanding continuously rather than operating on static assumptions. When you combine accurate self-knowledge with deep understanding of others, you create the foundation for effortless victory. You can position yourself to maximize your strengths while minimizing your weaknesses, and you can anticipate how others will respond to different approaches. This knowledge transforms conflict from unpredictable chaos into strategic chess, where victory becomes a matter of preparation and positioning rather than chance and force. The water clock of perfect timing in my chambers reminded me daily that water always finds the easiest path to its destination. This ancient timepiece, with its steady flow marking the passage of moments, taught me that timing is not about rushing or forcing outcomes, but about recognizing when conditions align for effortless action. Most people fail not because they lack good ideas or adequate resources, but because they act at the wrong time. They push when they should wait, they hesitate when they should move, and they mistake frantic activity for strategic progress. True timing requires the patience to wait for the perfect moment, combined with the decisiveness to act swiftly when that moment arrives. I learnt this principle through observing nature's rhythms. A river doesn't fight the mountain it flows around it, gradually wearing down the hardest stone through patient persistence. A tree doesn't force its growth, it responds to seasons, conserving energy in winter and expanding rapidly in spring. The most powerful forces in nature achieve their effects through perfect timing rather than brute force. During my campaign in the eastern provinces, I faced an enemy who controlled a series of fortified positions along a mountain pass. Direct assault would have been costly and potentially unsuccessful. Instead, I studied the seasonal patterns of the region and learned that heavy rains came every spring, flooding the valley and making the lower fortifications untenable. I positioned my forces and waited. For 3 months, my officers questioned my inaction, while the enemy grew confident in their defensive positions. When the spring rains came, their lower fortifications were abandoned without a fight. The flooding that they saw as a natural disaster, I had anticipated as a strategic opportunity, but the true demonstration of timing came next. As the enemy retreated to higher ground, they were exhausted from fighting the floods and psychologically defeated by what they perceived as divine intervention against them. In that moment of vulnerability, I struck with precision and overwhelming force. The campaign that could have lasted months was concluded in a single day. This is the essence of strategic timing, waiting for conditions to align in your favor, then acting with decisive swiftness when the moment is right. The 3 months of apparent inaction was actually the most active period of the campaign, during which I was positioning forces, gathering intelligence, and preparing for the inevitable opportunity. In your professional life, this same principle applies constantly. Instead of forcing conversations when emotions are high, you wait for moments when people are receptive to new ideas. Rather than launching projects when resources are scarce, you prepare thoroughly and act when conditions favor success. I once advised a talented artisan who was struggling to gain recognition for his work. He was constantly approaching potential patrons at inappropriate times when they were busy, stressed, or focused on other priorities. I taught him to study their rhythms, to understand when they were most receptive to new opportunities, and to position his work so that it would be discovered at the perfect moment. He began timing his presentations to coincide with seasonal festivals. When patrons were in generous moods and looking for new artisans, he positioned his best pieces where they would be noticed naturally rather than forced upon unwilling audiences. Within a year, his work was in demand, not because he had become more skilled, but because he had learned the art of perfect timing. The water clock taught me that timing has 3 essential components: preparation, patience, and decisive action. You must prepare thoroughly so that when the right moment arrives, you're ready to act. You must have the patience to wait for conditions to align rather than forcing premature action. And you must have the decisiveness to act swiftly when the moment is right. This requires constant awareness of changing conditions around you. Just as water responds instantly to new channels and obstacles, you must remain sensitive to shifts in circumstances that create new opportunities or close existing ones. The strategic advantage goes to those who can recognize these changes first and adapt their timing accordingly. Remember that perfect timing often appears to others as either luck or laziness. Those who don't understand strategic thinking will question your periods of apparent inaction and be surprised by your sudden, decisive moves. This is natural. They see only the visible action, not the patient preparation that makes effortless victory possible. The art of timing also requires understanding that different situations have different rhythms. Some opportunities require immediate action, others develop slowly over months or years. Mastery comes from recognizing which type of situation you're facing and adjusting your approach accordingly. When you truly understand timing, you stop fighting against circumstances and start flowing with them. You position yourself where favorable conditions are developing. You wait patiently for the right moment, and you act with certainty when that moment arrives. This is how water cuts through stone, not through force, but through perfect timing and persistent patience. The golden charm of allegiance was a small token I created to remind myself that true victory comes not from defeating enemies, but from transforming them into allies. This golden charm, engraved with the symbol of unity, was given to every general who chose to join my cause willingly rather than through force or coercion. It represented my understanding that lasting success requires winning hearts and minds, not just battles. The conventional approach to opposition is to overcome it through superior force or cunning manipulation. But I discovered that the most powerful strategy is to create conditions where former enemies choose to support you because doing so serves their own interests better than continued resistance. This principle emerged from my early experiences with captured officers. Initially, I followed standard military practice: execute the leaders, enslave the followers, and rule through fear. But I noticed that this approach created constant rebellion and required enormous resources to maintain control. Territories conquered through fear remained unstable and unproductive. The turning point came during my campaign against General Zhao, a skilled commander who had been causing significant problems for my forces. When I finally captured him, everyone expected me to make an example of him through public execution. Instead, I studied his background and discovered that he was fighting not from personal ambition, but from genuine concern for his people's welfare. I invited him to a private dinner and asked him directly, "What would it take for you to believe that your people would be better served by joining our cause than by continuing to resist it?" His answer revealed that he feared his soldiers would be treated as expendable cannon fodder and his people would be overtaxed to support my campaigns. Instead of dismissing these concerns, I addressed them systematically. I showed him how I treated my own soldiers not as disposable resources, but as valuable assets whose welfare directly impacted our collective success. I explained my tax policies and how they actually improved economic conditions in conquered territories. Most importantly, I offered him genuine authority over his men and his region, not just ceremonial titles. Within weeks, General Zhao became one of my most effective commanders. His transformation from enemy to ally was so complete that other generals began seeking opportunities to join us rather than face us in battle. The golden charm he received became a symbol that spread throughout the region, proof that I valued conversion over conquest. This principle works because it addresses the fundamental human need for respect and purpose. When you demonstrate that someone's talents and concerns are valued, they naturally gravitate toward cooperation rather than conflict. This is far more powerful than fear-based compliance because it creates genuine loyalty rather than grudging obedience. In your professional environment, this same approach transforms workplace dynamics. Instead of trying to outmaneuver difficult colleagues, you invest time in understanding their motivations and concerns. Rather than competing for limited resources, you create opportunities for mutual benefit that make collaboration more attractive than competition. I once observed a project manager who was struggling with a team that seemed constantly resistant to his initiatives. Instead of asserting authority or escalating to higher management, he spent individual time with each team member to understand their concerns and aspirations. He discovered that their resistance came not from laziness or defiance, but from fear that new processes would make their expertise obsolete. He addressed these concerns by involving them in designing the new processes, ensuring that their knowledge was incorporated and their roles were enhanced rather than diminished. The same people who had been his strongest opponents became his most enthusiastic supporters because they felt valued and empowered rather than threatened. This transformation required him to see his team members not as obstacles to overcome, but as valuable resources whose concerns needed to be addressed. The time he invested in understanding their perspectives paid dividends in improved cooperation and results. The key insight is that people resist when they feel their interests are threatened, but they cooperate when they see genuine benefits for themselves. Your role is not to convince them to sacrifice their interests for yours, but to create scenarios where their interests align with yours. This approach requires genuine respect for others' intelligence and legitimate concerns. You cannot fake this. People intuitively sense whether your interest in their welfare is genuine or manipulative. The golden charm represented authentic appreciation for the value that former enemies could bring to my cause. Remember that winning hearts and minds is not about being soft or permissive. It requires strong leadership combined with genuine respect for others' dignity and aspirations. You must be clear about your standards and expectations, while demonstrating that meeting those standards serves everyone's best interests. The most powerful aspect of this approach is that it creates exponential growth in your influence. When people genuinely choose to support you rather than being forced to comply, they become advocates who attract others to your cause. Each person you convert from opposition to alliance becomes a force multiplier for your objectives. This is why I preferred to capture enemy generals alive rather than killing them in battle. A dead enemy is simply eliminated, but a converted enemy becomes a new source of strength. The golden charm reminded me daily that true victory lies not in defeating opposition, but in transforming it into support. The efficiency abacus that sits on my desk represents one of my most important discoveries, the mathematics of strategic advantage. This calculating tool helped me determine the minimum force required for maximum effect, teaching me that efficiency is not about doing more with less, but about doing exactly what is needed at precisely the right moment for optimal results. Most people exhaust themselves through inefficient application of their resources. They work harder when they should work smarter. They apply maximum effort when targeted effort would be more effective, and they mistake busyness for productivity. True strategic thinking requires understanding how to achieve your objectives with the least expenditure of time, energy, and resources. I learned this principle through studying successful merchants as much as military commanders. A skilled trader doesn't carry more goods than necessary. He carries exactly what the market demands. He doesn't visit every possible customer. He focuses on those most likely to buy. He doesn't negotiate every possible deal. He pursues only those that offer genuine profit. This same thinking revolutionized my approach to military campaigns. Instead of trying to conquer every enemy stronghold, I identified which positions were truly strategic and which were merely symbolic. Rather than engaging every enemy force, I focused on those whose defeat would cascade into broader victories. Instead of using overwhelming force against every target, I calculated the precise pressure needed to achieve surrender. The principle proved itself during my campaign against the Three Kingdoms Alliance. Faced with a coalition of enemies, conventional wisdom suggested I needed to defeat each kingdom separately, requiring massive resources and years of campaigning. Instead, I studied the alliance structure and identified the weakest link, the kingdom, whose withdrawal would cause the entire alliance to collapse. I focused 80% of my intelligence gathering and strategic planning on this single target. When I finally moved against them, the campaign was swift and decisive because I had concentrated my efforts where they would have maximum impact. The other two kingdoms, seeing their alliance crumble, sued for peace without further conflict. This is the essence of economy of force, identifying the critical leverage points where minimal effort produces maximum results. Instead of trying to solve every problem, you focus on the problems whose solutions eliminate multiple other challenges. I once advised a struggling administrator who was overwhelmed by competing demands from different departments. He was trying to satisfy everyone equally, which meant no one was truly satisfied, and he was exhausted from constant firefighting. I taught him to identify which departments had the most influence over his success and which issues had the greatest impact on overall organizational performance. He began focusing his time and energy on the 3 most critical relationships and the 2 most important systemic issues. This reduced his workload by more than half, while dramatically improving his effectiveness. The departments that received less attention initially complained, but they soon realized that the improved overall performance benefited everyone. The efficiency abacus taught me that every resource expenditure should be calculated against its strategic return. Time spent on low-impact activities, no matter how urgent they seem, diverts resources from high-impact opportunities. Energy invested in marginal improvements prevents you from pursuing breakthrough innovations. This principle applies to everything from daily task management to long-term career planning. Instead of trying to be excellent at everything, you identify the few areas where excellence produces exponential returns. Rather than maintaining relationships with everyone, you invest deeply in connections that create mutual value. The key insight is that not all efforts are equal in their strategic value. Some activities, relationships, and objectives offer leverage that multiplies your impact, while others consume resources without meaningful returns. Mastery comes from developing the ability to distinguish between these categories and allocating your resources accordingly. I developed a simple framework for this analysis. Before committing resources to any objective, I would ask 3 questions. First, what is the minimum force required to achieve this result? Second, what other objectives become easier if this one is achieved? Third, what are the opportunity costs of pursuing this versus other available options? This framework prevented me from falling into the trap of applying maximum effort to every challenge. It forced me to think strategically about resource allocation and to recognize that sometimes the most powerful action is choosing not to act at all. Remember that economy of force is not about being lazy or avoiding difficult tasks. It's about being strategic in how you apply your finite resources for maximum impact. A river doesn't try to erode every rock in its path. It flows around obstacles and concentrates its force where it can cut new channels. The efficiency abacus reminds me daily that true power lies not in the amount of force you can generate, but in your ability to apply the right amount of force at the right time and place. This principle transforms exhausting struggles into elegant solutions, turning efficiency from a constraint into a strategic advantage. When you master the economy of force, you stop competing on effort and start competing on intelligence. You achieve more by doing less, but doing it with perfect precision and strategic timing. The shape-shifting blade in my personal collection represents one of the most powerful principles of strategic thinking, the ability to adapt your approach based on changing circumstances while maintaining your core objectives. This unique weapon could be reconfigured into different forms: sword, spear, or staff, depending on the tactical situation, teaching me that true strength lies not in rigid adherence to one method, but in formless adaptability. Most people fail because they become attached to specific tactics, methods, or approaches that worked in previous situations. They develop rigid thinking patterns that prevent them from responding effectively to new challenges. They mistake their methods for their goals and defend outdated approaches. Instead of adapting to current realities, I learned this principle through a humbling defeat early in my career. I had developed a successful tactical approach that had won several battles, and I became convinced that this method was universally applicable. When I faced an enemy who had studied my previous campaigns and prepared specifically to counter my standard tactics, I was defeated because I couldn't adapt quickly enough. That defeat taught me that no single approach, no matter how successful, should become a permanent strategy. The enemy learns, circumstances change, and what worked yesterday may fail tomorrow. Victory belongs to those who can shift their methods while maintaining their strategic direction. The shape-shifting blade became my reminder that adaptability requires maintaining a core of strength while allowing the surface forms to change. The blade's steel remained constant, but its configuration adapted to whatever the situation demanded. This is true formlessness, not the absence of structure, but the ability to restructure rapidly based on changing conditions. During my campaign against the Iron Mountain tribes, I encountered an enemy unlike any I had faced before. They used guerrilla tactics, avoided direct confrontation, and seemed to vanish into the landscape whenever I approached with conventional forces. My standard methods of siege warfare and pitched battles were useless against an enemy who refused to engage on those terms. Instead of becoming frustrated by their unconventional approach, I studied their methods and adapted my own tactics accordingly. I divided my forces into smaller, more mobile units that could match their flexibility. I adopted their knowledge of local terrain and weather patterns. I learned to think like they thought, to move like they moved, and to fight like they fought. But I didn't simply copy their methods, improved upon them. I used their own tactics against them while retaining the strategic advantages of my larger organization and superior resources. When they expected me to behave like a conventional army, I moved like a ghost. When they prepared for guerrilla warfare, I struck with coordinated precision. The campaign that could have lasted years was concluded in months because I had become formless, adapting my methods to match theirs while maintaining my strategic superiority. They could no longer predict my movements because I had no fixed pattern to predict. This principle revolutionized my approach to all challenges. Instead of trying to force every situation to fit my preferred methods, I learned to analyze each situation freshly and adapt my approach accordingly. I became like water taking the shape of whatever container I encountered while maintaining my essential nature in your professional environment. This same adaptability creates tremendous advantages. Instead of insisting that meetings be conducted your way, you learn to work effectively within different communication styles and organizational cultures. Rather than applying the same leadership approach to every team member, you adapt your style to what each person needs to perform at their best. I once observed a consultant who exemplified this principle perfectly. When working with clients, she presented comprehensive analyses with extensive documentation. With big picture executives, she focused on strategic implications and high-level with technical teams. She spoke their language and demonstrated deep understanding of their challenges. Her core expertise and values never changed, but her presentation and approach adapted to each audience. This flexibility made her incredibly effective across different types of organizations and situations. She succeeded not because she was the smartest person in the room, but because she was the most adaptable. The key insight is that formlessness doesn't mean having no principles or standards. It means having strong core values and objectives, while maintaining flexibility in how you pursue them. You must be firm about your destination, while remaining fluid about your route. This requires constant learning and observation. You must study how different people think, how various systems operate, and how changing circumstances create new opportunities and challenges. Adaptability comes from understanding patterns and principles, not from memorizing specific techniques. Remember that. True adaptability requires courage. It means abandoning comfortable methods when they no longer serve your objectives. It means learning new approaches even when you've achieved success with old ones. It means being willing to appear inconsistent to those who don't understand strategic thinking. The shape-shifting blade reminds me daily that strength comes not from rigidity, but from the ability to maintain your essential power, while adapting your form to meet whatever challenges arise. This is the path to effortless victory, not through forcing circumstances to match your methods, but through adapting your methods to flow with circumstances while maintaining your strategic direction. The lightning spear of decisive action hangs in my armory as a symbol of one of warfare's most powerful principles. When the moment for action arrives, you must strike with the speed and force of lightning. This ceremonial spear, forged from metals that conduct energy, reminds me that momentum is not just about moving fast. It's about building unstoppable force that makes victory inevitable. Most people understand the importance of timing, but they fail to grasp the critical role of momentum in strategic success. They wait for perfect conditions, then act tentatively when those conditions finally arrive. They mistake careful preparation for readiness to act decisively. True mastery requires the ability to build and maintain momentum once you begin moving toward your objectives. I learned this principle through observing natural phenomena before applying it to military campaigns. A river in flood doesn't trickle slowly toward the sea. It builds force as it moves, becoming more powerful with each mile. Lightning doesn't build up gradually in the sky. It accumulates energy invisibly, then releases it in a single, overwhelming burst. The same principle applies to strategic action. Once you begin moving toward an objective, every delay allows opposition to organize, circumstances to change, and your own energy to dissipate. Swift, decisive action compounds its own advantages, creating momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to stop. During the siege of Fortress Kangding, I faced a situation that perfectly demonstrated this principle. The fortress had withstood attacks for over a year, and the defenders had grown confident in their ability to outlast any assault. Previous commanders had attempted prolonged sieges, gradual approaches, and patient attrition, all of which had failed because they gave the defenders time to adapt and reinforce their position. I studied the fortress for weeks, but not to plan another gradual approach. I was identifying the exact sequence of actions that would create unstoppable momentum once I began. I located the weakest point in their defenses, mapped the precise timing needed for each phase of the assault, and prepared my forces for synchronized action. When I finally moved, the attack was like lightning striking the earth. Within the first hour, we had breached their outer defenses. Within 3 hours, we controlled their water supply. By sunset, the fortress that had resisted for over a year had surrendered completely. The key was not superior force or better equipment. It was the psychological impact of overwhelming momentum. Each success built upon the previous one, creating a cascade of advantages that the defenders couldn't counter quickly enough. They were defeated not by any single action, but by the accumulating force of coordinated momentum. This principle transforms how you approach any significant challenge. Instead of trying to make gradual progress over extended periods, you concentrate your efforts into focused bursts of decisive action. You build momentum systematically, then ride that momentum to complete success before opposition can organize. EFFECTIVELY. I once advised a merchant who was struggling to expand his business into new territories. He had been making tentative approaches to markets gradually, building relationships slowly, and expanding cautiously. This careful approach was actually working against him because it gave competitors time to respond and markets time to shift. We redesigned his expansion strategy around momentum building. He concentrated his resources on thoroughly dominating one new market before moving to the next. Once he achieved clear success in that market, he used that momentum to accelerate his expansion into adjacent territories. The same resources that had produced minimal results when spread across multiple efforts created dramatic success when concentrated for maximum impact. The lightning spear teaches us that momentum has 3 essential components: preparation, concentration, and acceleration. You must prepare thoroughly so that when you act, every element works in harmony. You must concentrate your resources at the point of maximum impact rather than spreading them across multiple objectives. And you must accelerate your efforts as you begin succeeding, using each victory to fuel the next action. This requires overcoming the natural tendency to slow down when you start succeeding. Many people become cautious just when they should become more aggressive. They worry about overextending themselves precisely when momentum could carry them to complete victory. Remember that momentum is as much psychological as physical. When people see you succeeding rapidly, they begin to expect your success and adjust their behavior accordingly. Competitors become defensive instead of aggressive. Potential allies become more willing to associate with you. Resources become more available because people want to be part of successful ventures. The key insight is that momentum creates its own advantages beyond the direct results of your actions. Fast success attracts resources, opportunities, and support that gradual progress cannot access. This is why decisive action often achieves more than careful, methodical approaches. However, momentum requires careful management. You must maintain forward progress without becoming reckless, and you must be prepared to shift direction quickly if circumstances change. The lightning spear strikes once with maximum force, but it must be aimed precisely to be effective. When you master the art of momentum, you stop trying to succeed gradually and start creating breakthrough results through concentrated, decisive action. You build unstoppable force that carries you to victory before opposition can organize effectively against you. The mask of many faces in my personal collection represents one of the most misunderstood aspects of strategic thinking, the art of strategic deception. These masks, each crafted to represent different roles and personas, were not tools of dishonesty, but instruments of misdirection that allowed me to gather intelligence and position my forces advantageously while concealing my true intentions from opponents. Strategic deception is perhaps the most controversial principle I teach, yet it is essential for effortless victory. Most people confuse deception with lying, but they are fundamentally different. Lying is about creating false information to deceive. Strategic deception is about controlling what information your opponents receive and how they interpret your actions, allowing them to deceive themselves. The principle operates on a simple truth. People make decisions based on the information available to them. If you can influence what information they receive and how they interpret it, you can influence their decisions without directly confronting their choices. This is not manipulation in the harmful sense. It is strategic positioning that allows you to achieve objectives with minimal conflict. I learned this principle through studying master hunters in my youth. A skilled hunter doesn't chase prey directly that would be exhausting and often unsuccessful. Instead, he understands the prey's behavior patterns and positions himself where the prey will naturally move. He appears weak when he is strong, hidden when he is present, and absent when he is near. The application to military strategy became clear during my campaign against General Liu, a commander known for his aggressive tactics and superior numbers. Direct confrontation would have been costly, even if successful. Instead, I studied his psychological patterns and discovered that he was impatient and proud, qualities I could use to my advantage. I began a series of apparent retreats, each time leaving behind evidence of hasty departure and signs of internal disagreement among my officers. I allowed him to capture supply trains that contained accurate but misleading information about my troop strength and planned movements. I appeared weak when I was actually strong, divided when I was unified, and fleeing when I was positioning. General Liu interpreted these signs according to his own assumptions and desires. He saw what he expected to see: a demoralized army in retreat, rather than what was actually happening. His aggressive nature compelled him to pursue what appeared to be easy victory, leading his forces deeper into terrain of my choosing. When I finally revealed my true position and strength, his army was scattered across unfavorable ground, pursuing an enemy that existed only in his imagination. The battle was over before it began because his decisions had been based on carefully crafted impressions rather than accurate intelligence. This is the essence of strategic deception, allowing opponents to make poor decisions based on their own assumptions and biases. I didn't lie to General Liu. I simply controlled what information he received, and allowed his own psychology to create the deception. In modern professional environments, this principle applies through strategic positioning and information management. You don't misrepresent your capabilities, but you control when and how you reveal them. You don't lie about your intentions, but you allow competitors to make assumptions based on incomplete information. I once observed a negotiator who mastered this principle perfectly. During complex business discussions, he would reveal his priorities gradually, allowing the other party to believe they understood his position before he disclosed additional factors that completely changed the strategic landscape. He never lied about anything, but he controlled the sequence and timing of information revelation. His counterparts would make offers based on what they thought were his primary concerns, only to discover that he had additional requirements they hadn't considered. This wasn't dishonesty, was strategic information management that allowed him to achieve better outcomes while maintaining complete integrity. The key insight is that strategic deception works best when it aligns with what opponents want to believe anyway. People tend to interpret ambiguous information in ways that confirm their existing assumptions and desires. Your role is to present information in ways that encourage them to reach conclusions that serve your strategic objectives. This requires deep understanding of psychology and human nature. You must know how different people process information, what biases influence their decision-making, and what they are predisposed to believe. The masks in my collection reminded me that everyone wears different faces in different situations. Understanding these personas is essential for strategic thinking. Remember that ethical strategic deception is about misdirection, not dishonesty. You are not creating false information. You are controlling attention, timing, and emphasis to influence how true information is interpreted. This distinction is crucial for maintaining integrity while achieving strategic advantages. The most powerful aspect of strategic deception is that it allows you to win without direct confrontation. When opponents make poor decisions based on their own misinterpretations, they defeat themselves. You achieve victory through superior positioning and psychological understanding rather than through force or conflict. The mask of many faces reminds me daily that everyone sees the world through their own assumptions and biases. Strategic thinking requires understanding these mental patterns and positioning yourself so that others' natural tendencies work in your favor rather than against you. The Iron Will medallion that I carried into every campaign serves as a constant reminder that true confidence comes not from bravado or false optimism, but from thorough preparation combined with accurate self-knowledge. This medallion, forged from metal that had withstood the test of fire, reminded me daily that unshakable confidence is built through systematic preparation, not wishful thinking. Most people confuse confidence with arrogance, but they are fundamentally different forces. Arrogance is confidence without foundation. It collapses when tested by reality. True confidence is certainty based on preparation, knowledge, and proven capability. It remains steady under pressure because it is built on solid ground rather than hopeful assumptions. I learned the difference between these forces through early failures that taught me humility and the importance of genuine preparation. In my youth, I possessed the natural arrogance of someone who had experienced some success but hadn't been thoroughly tested. This false confidence nearly destroyed me when I faced challenges that exceeded my actual capabilities. The transformation began during the siege of Wucheng, where I faced an enemy commander who was more experienced, better supplied, and fighting on familiar terrain. My initial confidence quickly crumbled when my standard tactics proved ineffective against his sophisticated defenses. I was forced to confront the gap between my assumed abilities and my actual skills. Instead of retreating or persisting with failing approaches, I used this crisis as an opportunity to build genuine confidence through systematic preparation. I spent weeks studying his previous campaigns, analyzing his decision-making patterns, and identifying his strengths and potential weaknesses. I gathered intelligence about his supply lines, his political pressures, and his personal motivations. More importantly, I conducted an honest assessment of my own capabilities. I identified skills I needed to develop, knowledge gaps I needed to fill, and resources I needed to acquire. I prepared contingency plans for different scenarios and rehearsed my responses to likely challenges. When I finally resumed the siege, my confidence was qualitatively different. It was no longer based on optimism or past successes, but on thorough understanding of the situation and careful preparation for multiple contingencies. This confidence communicated itself to my officers and soldiers, who responded with increased trust and commitment. The siege that had initially seemed impossible became manageable through methodical application of strategic principles. Each phase of the campaign unfolded according to my analysis and preparation. When unexpected challenges arose, I was ready with appropriate responses because I had anticipated and prepared for various possibilities. This experience taught me that unshakable confidence has three essential components: preparation, competence, and perspective. You must prepare thoroughly for the challenges you face. You must develop genuine competence through practice and study. And you must maintain perspective about both your capabilities and your limitations. The Iron Will medallion reminds me that confidence, like iron, must be forged through heat and pressure to become truly strong. Challenges that initially seem to threaten your confidence actually provide opportunities to strengthen it through successful navigation of difficulty. In your professional life, this same principle applies to every significant challenge. Instead of hoping for success or relying on past achievements, you build confidence through systematic preparation and skill development. You study the situation thoroughly, develop your capabilities systematically, and prepare for multiple scenarios. I once observed a young administrator who was promoted to a position that initially overwhelmed her. Instead of pretending confidence she didn't feel or retreating from the challenge, she approached the situation systematically. She identified the key skills her new role required and developed them through study and practice. She sought mentorship from successful people in similar positions. She prepared thoroughly for each important meeting and decision. Within months, her initial uncertainty had transformed into genuine confidence based on growing competence and systematic preparation. People began seeking her advice and leadership because her confidence was obviously grounded in real capability rather than empty assertion. The key insight is that confidence is not something you either have or lack. It is something you build through deliberate practice and preparation. Each challenge you navigate successfully becomes foundation for confidence in future situations. Each skill you develop genuinely increases your capacity to handle complexity and pressure. This requires honesty about your current limitations, combined with commitment to expanding your capabilities. False confidence based on denying your weaknesses will collapse under pressure. True confidence acknowledges limitations while systematically working to overcome them. Remember that genuine confidence is attractive to others because it signals competence and reliability. People naturally gravitate toward those who demonstrate quiet certainty based on proven ability. This confidence becomes a strategic asset that opens opportunities and builds trust. The medallion also reminds me that confidence must be maintained through ongoing preparation and learning. Past successes provide foundation, but each new challenge requires fresh preparation and often new skills. Confidence is not a permanent state, but a dynamic quality that must be renewed through continued growth. When you cultivate true confidence, through systematic preparation and genuine competence, you stop needing to prove yourself to others and start focusing on achieving objectives. This confidence enables effortless leadership because people naturally follow those who demonstrate quiet certainty based on real capability. The Gentle Commander's seal in my personal collection bears the inscription "Lead by example, not by command," representing one of my most important discoveries about true leadership. This seal, used only for the most significant documents, reminded me that the greatest leaders inspire rather than compel, attract rather than coerce, and create willing followers rather than reluctant subordinates. Most people believe that leadership requires the ability to force compliance through authority, intimidation, or manipulation. But I learned that the most powerful form of leadership is that which makes people want to follow you, not because they have to, but because they genuinely believe in your direction and trust your judgment. This understanding emerged from observing the difference between commanders who ruled through fear and those who led through inspiration. Fear-based leadership produces immediate compliance, but creates long-term instability. People follow reluctantly, contribute minimally, and abandon the leader at the first opportunity. Inspiration-based leadership produces voluntary commitment that persists even through difficult circumstances. The principle crystallized during my campaign in the southern provinces, where I inherited command of an army that had been demoralized by a series of defeats under previous leadership. The soldiers were competent, but had lost confidence in their officers and their mission. Traditional military discipline was insufficient to restore their effectiveness. They needed inspiration, not intimidation, instead of asserting authority. Through punishment and rigid control, I began by demonstrating the kind of leadership I expected from others. I shared the same risks as my soldiers, ate the same food, and endured the same hardships. When we faced difficult terrain, I walked alongside the common soldiers rather than riding in comfort. When supplies were short, I reduced my own rations before asking others to do the same. More importantly, I involved them in planning and decision-making rather than simply issuing orders. I explained the reasoning behind our strategies, sought their input on tactical decisions, and acknowledged their expertise in areas where they had knowledge I lacked. I treated them as partners in achieving our objectives rather than instruments for implementing my will. This approach required patience and genuine respect for their intelligence and dignity. It would have been faster to simply command obedience, but that would have produced temporary compliance rather than lasting commitment. By investing time in earning their trust and respect, I created a foundation for extraordinary performance. The transformation was remarkable. The same soldiers who had been listless and reluctant under previous commanders became energetic and innovative under leadership that valued their contributions. They began suggesting improvements to our tactics, volunteering for difficult assignments, and supporting each other in ways that made the entire army more effective. When we finally engaged the enemy, my forces fought with a cohesion and determination that surprised our opponents. They weren't fighting because they were forced to, they were fighting because they believed in our cause and trusted our leadership. This voluntary commitment created a qualitative advantage that superior numbers or equipment couldn't match. The Gentle Commander's seal reminds me that people perform best when they feel valued, understood, and empowered to contribute meaningfully. Leadership that inspires voluntary excellence will always outperform leadership that compels reluctant compliance in your professional environment. This same principle creates extraordinary results. Instead of managing through control and micromanagement, you lead through clarity of vision, consistency of values, and genuine respect for others' capabilities. You create conditions where people want to excel rather than simply avoid punishment. I once observed a project manager who exemplified this approach perfectly. Instead of assigning tasks and monitoring compliance, she involved her team in defining objectives and developing solutions. She provided clear context for how their work contributed to larger goals, offered support for their professional development, and recognized their achievements meaningfully. Her team consistently delivered exceptional results, not because they were forced to, but because they felt personally invested in the success of projects. They took initiative, supported each other, and often exceeded expectations because they felt valued and empowered rather than controlled and monitored. The key insight is that people naturally want to contribute to something meaningful and be part of successful endeavors. Your role as a leader is to create an environment where these natural motivations can flourish, rather than trying to substitute external pressure for internal motivation. This requires genuine care for others' growth and success, not just their productivity. You must be willing to invest time in understanding their aspirations, developing their capabilities, and providing opportunities for meaningful contribution. This investment pays exponential returns in loyalty, innovation, and performance. Remember that leading by example means embodying the standards you expect from others. You cannot inspire excellence while accepting mediocrity from yourself. You cannot build trust while being unreliable. You cannot demand commitment while remaining detached from shared challenges. The seal also reminds me that true leadership is measured not by the obedience you can command, but by the excellence you can inspire. When people follow you willingly and perform at their best because they believe in your leadership, you have achieved the supreme form of influence. This approach requires courage, because it means giving up some direct control in exchange for much greater influence. It means trusting others to make good decisions when given proper context and support. But this trust, when earned and reciprocated, creates organizational strength that cannot be achieved through force or manipulation. When you master the art of leading without force, you stop needing to push people toward objectives and start attracting them toward shared vision. This transformation makes leadership effortless because you're working with natural, human motivations rather than against them. The harmony stone in my meditation chamber is a smooth river stone that reminds me of one of nature's most powerful lessons. Even the hardest obstacles can be worn down gradually through patient, persistent pressure applied at the right points. This simple stone taught me that opposition doesn't always need to be confronted directly. Often it can be neutralized through strategic patience and making resistance irrelevant. Most people exhaust themselves fighting against opposition when they could achieve better results by making that opposition irrelevant or converting it into support. Direct confrontation should be the last resort, not the first response. The most elegant victories come from positioning yourself so that opposition naturally dissolves rather than requiring defeat. I discovered this principle through studying how rivers reshape landscapes over time. Water doesn't fight them, finds the cracks, applies gentle but persistent pressure, and gradually creates new channels that redirect the entire flow. What appears immovable to force yields to patience and strategic pressure applied consistently over time. The principle proved itself during my dealings with General Han, a rival commander who had been systematically undermining my influence at court through political maneuvering and character assassination. Direct confrontation would have created a destructive conflict that could have damaged both our reputations and weakened our military effectiveness. Instead of responding to his attacks or attempting to discredit him in return, I studied his position and identified his vulnerabilities. I discovered that his political influence depended on a network of relationships with court officials who valued military success above political loyalty. His attacks on me were actually creating doubt about his own judgment among people who had observed my battlefield effectiveness, rather than defending myself against his accusations. I focused on demonstrating consistent competence and reliability in my duties. I made myself increasingly valuable to the same officials he was trying to influence against me. I created opportunities for them to observe my character and capabilities directly rather than relying on second-hand reports. More importantly, I identified areas where General Han and I had common interests, despite our rivalry. We both wanted strong military forces, effective border security, and respect for military professionals at court. I began supporting initiatives that served these common interests, often in ways that made his opposition to me appear petty and counterproductive. Over time, his attacks on me began to undermine his own credibility rather than mine. Officials who had initially been sympathetic to his concerns began to question his motives and judgment. His political allies started distancing themselves from what appeared to be a personal vendetta rather than legitimate professional criticism. The transformation was so gradual that he didn't recognize what was happening until his influence had already shifted. By the time he realized that his opposition to me was damaging his own position, he had no choice but to seek reconciliation. What began as hostile rivalry ended with respectful collaboration because I had made continued opposition costly for him while making cooperation beneficial. This approach required tremendous patience and self-discipline. It would have been emotionally satisfying to respond to his attacks directly, but that would have created the kind of destructive conflict I was trying to avoid. Instead, I focused on long-term positioning that made his opposition unsustainable. The Harmony Stone reminds me that this approach works because it aligns with natural forces rather than fighting against them. People naturally gravitate toward those who provide value and away from those who create problems. By consistently providing value while allowing my opponent to create his own problems, I influence the natural flow of relationships and loyalties. In your professional environment, this same principle allows you to neutralize difficult colleagues, unreasonable demands, and political opposition without destructive confrontation. Instead of fighting directly against people who oppose you, you make yourself increasingly valuable while allowing their opposition to reveal its own weaknesses. I once observed a manager who used this approach with a colleague who was constantly undermining her initiatives through criticism and passive resistance. Instead of confronting him directly or complaining to superiors, she began documenting the success of her projects and involving other team members in planning and implementation. Over time, his resistance became increasingly isolated and obviously counterproductive. Other colleagues began to see him as an obstacle to shared success rather than a legitimate critic. Eventually, he either had to change his approach or risk being seen as the problem, rather than pointing out problems. The key insight is that sustainable solutions come from changing underlying dynamics rather than winning individual battles. When you make opposition costly and cooperation beneficial, you create conditions where reasonable people naturally choose to work with you rather than against you. This requires understanding what motivates your opposition and what pressures influence their behavior. Usually, difficult people are responding to their own insecurities, pressures, or misunderstandings. Address these underlying causes and the opposition often dissolves naturally. Remember that this approach takes time and requires consistent execution. You cannot expect immediate results, but you can expect lasting solutions that don't require ongoing conflict management. The Harmony Stone reminds me that gentle, persistent pressure applied strategically over time can reshape even the most stubborn obstacles. When you master the art of neutralizing opposition without conflict, you stop creating enemies and start converting obstacles into opportunities for demonstrating your strategic thinking and problem-solving capabilities. The eternal flame torch that burns continuously in my study represents the most important principle of strategic thinking, creating advantages that endure beyond individual victories. This torch kept burning through careful tending and systematic fuel management. reminds me that true success comes not from winning single battles, but from building systems that produce ongoing victories with minimal effort. Most people focus on immediate results and short-term wins, exhausting themselves in constant struggles that must be fought again and again. They achieve temporary successes that require continuous effort to maintain, never building the foundation for lasting advantage. True strategic thinking creates systems that work for you even when you're not actively managing them. I learned this principle through observing the difference between conquerors who built lasting empires and those whose victories crumbled immediately after their deaths. The difference lay not in their battlefield tactics, but in their ability to create self-sustaining systems that continued producing favorable results. Long after the initial effort was invested, the principle crystallized during my governance of the conquered territories in the eastern provinces. Initially, I ruled through direct military control, stationed forces in every major city, and enforced compliance through constant supervision. This approach worked, but required enormous resources and created ongoing resentment that threatened long-term stability. I realized that this approach was fundamentally flawed because it created dependency rather than sustainability. If I removed the military pressure, resistance would immediately return. I was winning battles but not creating lasting victory because I wasn't addressing the underlying dynamics that created conflict. Instead of continuing to rule through force, I began building systems that aligned local interests with imperial objectives. I established trade networks that made prosperity dependent on peaceful cooperation. I created educational institutions that spread values and knowledge that supported stable governance. I developed administrative systems that provided clear benefits to local leaders who participated constructively. Most importantly, I invested in infrastructure, roads, irrigation systems, and communication networks that created ongoing value for local populations while serving imperial strategic objectives. These improvements made rebellion costly because it would destroy systems that people had come to depend upon for their prosperity and security. The transformation took years rather than months, but the results were remarkable. Territories that had required constant military supervision became self-governing provinces that actively supported imperial objectives. Local leaders who had initially resisted occupation became advocates for continued association because they benefited from the systems I had established. The eternal flame reminds me that sustainable advantage requires patient investment in systems rather than just tactics. You must build foundations that continue producing favorable results, even when you're focused on other challenges in your professional environment. This same principle transforms how you approach career development and organizational influence. Instead of fighting for individual promotions or recognition, you build systems that make your value increasingly obvious and difficult to replace. I once observed a department head who exemplified this approach perfectly. Instead of competing for resources through political maneuvering, she built processes that consistently delivered exceptional results. She developed training systems that made her entire team more effective. She created measurement systems that made her department's value clearly visible to senior management. More importantly, she built relationships and knowledge networks that made her a natural hub for critical information and decision-making. People came to her not because she demanded attention, but because she had made herself genuinely useful in ways that others couldn't easily replicate. When promotion opportunities arose, she didn't need to campaign for advancement because her value had become systematically obvious to decision-makers. When organizational changes occurred, her position remained secure because the systems she had built were too valuable to disrupt. The key insight is that sustainable advantage comes from becoming indispensable through systematic value creation, rather than through political positioning or temporary victories. You build capabilities, relationships, and knowledge that compound over time, rather than requiring constant renewal. This requires thinking beyond immediate objectives to consider how today's actions create tomorrow's opportunities. Every project becomes a chance to build capabilities. Every relationship becomes part of a growing network. And every success becomes foundation for greater future advantages. Remember that sustainable systems require ongoing maintenance and adaptation. The eternal flame burns continuously because it receives consistent attention and fuel. Your strategic advantages must be nurtured and updated regularly to remain effective as circumstances change. The torch also reminds me that the most powerful systems appear effortless to outside observers because all the work was invested in their creation and maintenance rather than in their daily operation. What looks like natural talent or luck is usually the result of systematic investment in capabilities and relationships over time. This approach requires patience because sustainable advantages take time to develop. You must resist the temptation to pursue quick wins that don't contribute to long-term positioning. But this patience pays exponential returns as your systems begin generating advantages with minimal ongoing effort. When you master the art of creating sustainable advantage, you stop competing on effort and start competing on systems. You build foundations that make success increasingly inevitable rather than constantly struggling to force favorable outcomes through willpower and determination. The eternal flame burns on, reminding me that true strategic victory lies not in any single achievement, but in creating conditions where favorable outcomes become the natural result of systems you have carefully constructed and maintained. The sheathed sword of measured response hangs in my personal quarters as a symbol of one of the most difficult yet powerful principles in strategic thinking, knowing when not to act. This ceremonial sword, which remains sheathed throughout my most important victories, represents the understanding that true power often lies in restraint rather than action, in strategic patience rather than immediate response. Most people believe that strength requires constant action and immediate response to every challenge or opportunity. They mistake activity for progress and reaction for strategy. But I learned that the greatest strategic advantage often comes from having the discipline to do nothing when action would be counterproductive, and the wisdom to wait when others feel compelled to move. This principle emerged from studying the natural world, where the most successful predators are those who exercise perfect patience. A master hunter doesn't chase every potential prey. He waits for the perfect opportunity when success is virtually guaranteed. He conserves energy for moments when action will produce maximum results with minimum risk. The lesson crystallized during the siege of Longshan, where I faced an enemy commander who was attempting to provoke me into premature action through a series of minor raids and psychological provocations. His strategy was designed to make me respond emotionally rather than strategically, forcing me to attack before conditions favored success. My officers urged immediate retaliation, arguing that failure to respond would appear weak and damage morale. The conventional military wisdom suggested that every provocation required an answer, every challenge demanded a response. But I recognized that this was exactly what my opponent wanted to control my timing and dictate the terms of engagement. Instead of responding to his provocations, I maintained absolute discipline and continued with my original strategic plan. I allowed his raids to appear successful while systematically strengthening my position and weakening his. I used his impatience against him, allowing him to exhaust his forces in attacks that achieved nothing while my position grew stronger daily. The restraint was psychologically difficult. Every instinct demanded action, every advisor questioned my apparent passivity, and every provocation felt like a challenge to my authority that required immediate response. But I kept the sheathed sword before me as a reminder that the greatest power is often power held in reserve. After weeks of apparent inaction on my part, my opponent became increasingly desperate and began making errors in judgment. His minor raids escalated into major attacks that overextended his forces and revealed his weaknesses. When I finally acted, it was with overwhelming force at precisely the moment when his army was most vulnerable. The victory was so complete that it appeared effortless to observers. They saw only the final decisive action, not the weeks of disciplined restraint that made that action possible. The sheathed sword had proved more powerful than any drawn blade because it represented strategic patience rather than emotional reaction. This principle applies powerfully in professional environments where the pressure to respond immediately to every email, every criticism, every competitive move can prevent strategic thinking. Learning when not to act often provides greater advantage than knowing how to act. I once observed an executive who exemplified this principle during a corporate crisis. When competitors began spreading rumors about his company's financial stability, his instinct was to respond immediately with public statements and defensive measures. Instead, he exercised strategic restraint, allowing the rumors to reveal themselves as unfounded while quietly strengthening his company's actual position. His restraint allowed competitors to overextend themselves in attempts to exploit what they perceived as weakness. When the rumors proved false and his company's strength became apparent, his competitors had wasted resources and damaged their own credibility through premature actions based on incomplete information. The key insight is that restraint is not passivity, is strategic choice. You choose not to act when action would serve your opponent's interests better than your own. You conserve energy and resources for moments when they can achieve maximum impact, rather than dissipating them in reactive responses. This requires tremendous emotional discipline because restraint often feels like weakness, especially when others are pressuring you to act. You must have confidence in your strategic analysis, even when others question your apparent inaction. The sheathed sword reminds me that true strength is demonstrated by the ability to choose restraint when action would be counterproductive. Remember that strategic restraint requires clear criteria for when action becomes appropriate. You are not avoiding action permanently, you are waiting for conditions that favor decisive success. This means continuously monitoring the situation and remaining ready to act swiftly when the moment arrives. The sword also represents the psychological power of known capability held in reserve. When others know you could act but choose not to, your restraint often has more impact than action would. It suggests confidence and strategic thinking that can be more intimidating than immediate response. This principle requires distinguishing between opportunities that demand immediate action and those that benefit from patient development. Some situations deteriorate if not addressed quickly, while others improve with strategic patience. Mastery comes from recognizing which type of situation you face. When you master the wisdom of restraint, you stop feeling compelled to respond to every provocation and start choosing your actions based on strategic advantage rather than emotional reaction. You learn to use time as a weapon, allowing circumstances to develop in your favor before committing your resources to action. The sheathed sword remains ready but unused, its power magnified by the discipline required to keep it sheathed when others would have drawn it long ago. The student's practice scroll contains the distilled wisdom of everything I have learned about effortless victory, organized into practical steps that any person can implement regardless of their current circumstances. This scroll, worn smooth from constant use during my own development, represents the transformation from theoretical understanding to practical mastery of strategic thinking. The path to effortless victory begins with a fundamental shift in mindset. You must stop seeing challenges as obstacles to overcome through force and start seeing them as puzzles to solve through strategic positioning. This change in perspective transforms exhausting struggles into elegant solutions and converts resistance Into cooperation, your first practice must be the daily discipline of strategic observation. Each morning, before engaging with the day's challenges, spend time analyzing your current position and the forces affecting your objectives. Ask yourself, where am I trying to force outcomes instead of positioning for natural success? What opportunities am I missing because I'm focused on direct confrontation? How can I achieve my goals through strategic positioning rather than harder work? This daily practice develops your strategic intuition, the ability to recognize patterns and opportunities that others miss. Most people react to circumstances as they arise, but strategic thinkers anticipate developments and position themselves advantageously before others recognize what's happening. The second essential practice is systematic intelligence gathering about your environment and the people within it. Study the motivations, pressures, and decision-making patterns of those who influence your success. Understand what they value, what they fear, and what would make cooperation with you more attractive than competition against you. This isn't manipulation. It's strategic empathy that allows you to create mutually beneficial outcomes. When you understand what others truly need, you can position your objectives so that achieving them also serves their interests. This alignment makes resistance unnecessary and cooperation logical. Third, develop the discipline of strategic timing. Instead of acting immediately when opportunities arise, learn to evaluate whether conditions favor success or whether patient preparation would produce better results. Master the art of building momentum systematically rather than dissipating energy through premature action. This requires overcoming the modern addiction to immediate response and constant activity. Strategic thinking often appears like inaction to those who don't understand the preparation happening beneath the surface. Develop comfort with periods of apparent inactivity while you're actually positioning for decisive success. Fourth, practice the art of effortless influence through demonstrated value rather than persuasive argument. Instead of trying to convince people to support your objectives, create situations where supporting you clearly serves their interests. Build your reputation through consistent competence rather than self-promotion. This approach takes longer than direct persuasion, but creates much stronger and more lasting influence. People who choose to support you because they see the benefit are far more committed than those who are convinced through argument or pressure. Fifth, cultivate the patience to build sustainable systems rather than pursuing quick victories that require constant renewal. Invest time in developing capabilities, relationships, and processes that continue producing favorable results with minimal ongoing effort. This means thinking beyond immediate objectives to consider how today's actions create tomorrow's opportunities. Every interaction becomes a chance to build relationships. Every project becomes an opportunity to demonstrate capabilities, and every success becomes foundation for greater future advantages. The most important practice is regular self-assessment and strategy adjustment. Your approach must evolve as your circumstances change and your capabilities develop. What works in your current position may limit you in your next role. Strategic thinking requires constant learning and adaptation. Set aside time each week to review your progress, analyze what's working and what isn't, and adjust your approach based on new information and changing circumstances. This reflective practice prevents you from becoming attached to outdated strategies and ensures your approach remains aligned with current realities. Remember that mastering effortless victory is itself a long-term strategic objective that requires patient development. You cannot expect to transform your entire approach overnight, but you can begin implementing these practices immediately and building competence gradually over time. Start with small situations where the stakes are low and the principles are easy to apply. Practice strategic positioning in minor negotiations, workplace interactions, and personal relationships. As your confidence and competence grow, you can apply these principles to increasingly important and complex challenges. The student's practice scroll reminds me that knowledge without application remains merely theory. The path to effortless victory requires daily practice, constant learning, and the patience to develop mastery gradually, rather than expecting immediate transformation. Each principle I have shared becomes powerful only through consistent application in real situations. You must move beyond understanding these concepts to making them natural responses to the challenges you face. This transformation from conscious effort to unconscious competence is the true goal of strategic development. Begin today with whatever situation currently challenges you, instead of approaching it through force or direct confrontation. Apply the principles of positioning, timing, and strategic influence. Look for ways to make success easier rather than working harder, and seek solutions that convert resistance into cooperation. The scroll has guided countless students from theoretical understanding to practical mastery. Let it guide you on your own journey toward effortless victory. The Master's legacy seal sits before me as I reflect on a lifetime spent learning and teaching the art of effortless victory. This final seal, to be passed to those who will carry these principles forward, bears the inscription, "Wisdom flows like water," a reminder that true mastery lies not in rigid application of techniques, but in the fluid adaptation of timeless principles to ever-changing circumstances. As I look back on decades of campaigns, negotiations, and strategic challenges, I realize that the greatest transformation was not in my external achievements, but in my internal approach to life itself. The principles of effortless victory changed not just how I fought battles, but how I lived, how I approached relationships, how I solved problems, and how I found peace within complexity. The young commander who once believed that victory required overwhelming force has been replaced by someone who understands that true power lies in strategic positioning, perfect timing, and the wisdom to know when not to act. This transformation didn't happen overnight, was the result of countless small choices to think strategically rather than react emotionally, to seek understanding rather than immediate advantage, and to build systems rather than win battles. What I want you to understand, above all else, is that these principles extend far beyond military strategy or professional advancement. They represent a way of living that reduces unnecessary conflict, conserves energy for what truly matters, and creates sustainable success in every area of life. When you truly embrace effortless victory, you stop fighting against the natural flow of circumstances and start positioning yourself where that flow carries you toward your objectives. You cease trying to force outcomes through willpower and determination alone, and begin creating conditions where favorable outcomes become inevitable. This doesn't mean becoming passive or avoiding challenges. It means approaching challenges with strategic intelligence rather than brute force. It means understanding that the most elegant solutions often appear effortless because all the effort was invested in positioning and preparation rather than in the moment of action itself. The legacy I hope to leave is not a collection of military tactics, but a framework for thinking that serves you regardless of the specific challenges you face. Whether you're navigating corporate politics, building relationships, pursuing personal goals, or solving complex problems, these principles provide a foundation for achieving more with less effort and stress. The art of effortless winning transforms how you see obstacles not as problems to overcome through force, but as information about how to position yourself more advantageously. It changes how you approach opposition, not as enemies to defeat, but as forces to redirect or convert. It revolutionizes how you think about time, not as pressure to act immediately, but as a strategic resource to be used wisely. Most importantly, it gives you permission to be strategic rather than just hard-working. intelligent rather than just determined, and patient rather than just persistent. In a world that often rewards frantic activity and immediate response, these principles offer a different path, one that leads to greater success with less exhaustion. My final challenge to you is this: begin implementing these principles immediately, but with patience for long-term development. Start with small situations where you can practice strategic thinking without major consequences. Build your confidence and competence gradually, always remembering that mastery comes through consistent application rather than perfect understanding. Look for opportunities to position yourself advantageously rather than competing directly. Seek ways to make cooperation more attractive than competition. Practice the discipline of strategic timing rather than immediate reaction. Build systems that work for you rather than constantly working harder yourself. Remember that the goal is not to avoid all conflict, but to engage in conflict strategically rather than emotionally. Not to eliminate all effort, but to ensure your efforts are applied where they can achieve maximum impact. Not to manipulate others, but to understand them well enough to create genuine mutual benefit. The master's legacy seal will pass to others who understand that true strength lies not in the ability to force outcomes, but in the wisdom to position yourself where favorable outcomes become natural results of strategic thinking and patient preparation. Carry these principles forward, adapt them to your circumstances, improve upon them through your own experience, and most importantly, live them daily until strategic thinking becomes as natural as breathing. The art of effortless victory awaits your mastery. Begin today, wherever you are, with whatever challenges you face. Let strategic wisdom transform struggle into flow, conflict into cooperation, and effort into elegance. This is my gift to you, not just knowledge, but a way of living that creates success through intelligence rather than force, positioning rather than pressure, and wisdom rather than mere effort. Go forth and win effortlessly.